Boldwood presents Woden's Spear, written by Donovan Cook and read by Sean Barrett. Chapter 1. AD 449, Old Saxony. The flames of the hearth fire danced as smoke drifted towards the thatched roof of the mead hall, collecting in a thick cloud before seeping through the straw and escaping into the night sky. Logs crackled and sparked as embers jumped out of the flames to land on the large stones which surrounded the hearth fire. Two slaves, their faces glistening with sweat, huffed as they turned two boar carcasses over the flames, the smell of the roasting meat making those in the hall salivate in anticipation. The timber walls of the mead hall trembled as Saxon warriors sang songs of old battles while stamping their feet and banging their cups on the tables that lined the walls. Women laughed as they gossiped and pointed at drunken men, while hounds crawled under the tables in search of scraps dropped by drunken eaters. Slaves moved around the hall like bees hopping from flower to flower as they refilled cups and handed out food, while children ran around the hall, playing out mock battles to the amusement of the adults as the early summer sun sat low in the sky outside the hall, and the birds returned to their favoured trees to roost. Octa's mouth watered as the smell of the roasted boar reached his nostrils, and his stomach rumbled like an angry wolf. With his glassy eyes, he stared at the boars and licked his lips as he waited for the slaves to bring him a cut of meat. Octa was tall and had broad shoulders, like most of the men in the hall, and had seen almost 18 winters. His long hair was worn loose, and his beard had been trimmed. Not that he usually wore it long, but he wanted to look his best for the feast. On his fingers he wore rings of gold and silver, with thick golden bracelets around his wrists. "Drink!" Otric, Octa's cousin and younger by a season, shouted, and the group sitting around them at the high table cheered before they emptied their cups. Octa wiped his mouth clean with the back of his hand and laughed as one man, the same age as him, vomited over his leather shoes. "Bastard can't hold his mead," Otric said, laughing as he smacked the table. Octa laughed as he pushed the man over so he landed in his own vomit, which only made the others cheer even more. The man stayed where he was, too drunk to get back to his seat, and soon their laughter was interrupted by loud snores. Octa and his cousin, along with their friends, had been drinking for most of the day, and by the time the feast to celebrate the coming battle had started, Octa's head was already spinning. But he was the son of a warlord, and not just any warlord. He was the son of Frithawald, the cousin of Witta, who was the mightiest warlord of the Saxon people. Octa lifted his cup and puffed out his chest. "Tomorrow we face the bastard Thuringians, who have been trying to steal our lands. We will greet them with Saxon spears and feed the ravens of Woden." Octa emptied his cup as his friends cheered and stamped their feet before they drank from their own cups. He winked at Heilwig, the daughter of one of Witta's warriors, and she blushed before her mother pulled her away and her father glared at him. Octa didn't care. He was too drunk and too full of himself to even think that the warrior might try to hurt him. "Silence!" Octa's father roared, his hard voice hushing the mead hall of Witta. Octa looked towards his father, and for a moment feared that he had angered the man he barely knew. But his father was not paying any attention to him as he sat down again. Witta, the man the other warlords had voted as chief warlord, stood and stared at Octa before he turned his attention to the rest of the hall. "My friends," he paused until he had the attention of everyone in the mead hall, which didn't take long. Witta was a barrel-chested man with a thick neck and eyes that promised nothing but violence. His trunk-like arms were covered in scars from the many battles he had fought, while they said his back contained not a single one. Witta was one of the greatest warriors of the Saxon people and the most powerful of the warlords. Octa remembered hearing stories of how Witta fought giants and trolls, of how he slew dragons in far lands and took their treasures for himself. That was how he had built his famous mead hall and filled his benches with more warriors than any of the other warlords. That was also the reason the other warlords had voted for Witta to be the chief warlord when the Thuringians, a tribe from the southeast, started pushing into Saxon lands. The Thuringians and the Saxons had raided each other's lands for many generations and had fought battles against each other. But the Thuringians had always stayed in their lands. That was until a new threat came from the east, and, since then, they had heard of many tribes pushing westwards to escape this threat. "We live in troubled times. For as long as we can remember, we have lived in these lands with the Romans to the south, the Franks to the west, and the Angles to the north. We lived in some sort of peace. We raided alongside the Franks, and we traded with the Angles. The gods blessed us, and we prospered." The warriors cheered and called out to the gods. "But the gods are angry, and so we suffer. They are angry because tribes come from the east, chased here by creatures they say are half horse and half man, and for too long we have done nothing about it." Many of those in the hall rubbed the metal of their sax knives to ward off the evil of the horse people from the east. Octa had heard of them. They all had heard of the Huns, a people so frightening that even the mighty Roman Empire cowered from them. "And now we must defend our lands from those tribes. The gods demand it." Again the warriors cheered. Witta waited for the mead hall to calm down, and then indicated for his son to stand. Othrig swayed slightly, but he straightened his back and puffed out his chest. Octa's cousin looked very much like the son of the richest warlord should. He was handsome and, like his father, had a broad chest and thick arms. He wore a fine tunic made especially for him by his mother for this feast, and wore a thick golden chain around his neck. "We have learnt of a large raiding party who think they can attack our people and steal from them. Tomorrow, my son, Othric, will lead some of our army to the east and send those bastards back to where they came from." Witta's voice thundered the last words, and the mead hall shook as the warriors cheered and bumped their fists against the tables. Hounds howled at the noise, and Octa shivered with excitement. Like Othric, this was to be his first battle, and he was determined to make the gods and his father proud. He looked at his father, who was lean and broad-shouldered, and had a scar over his left eye. Frithavold had fought for the Romans in his youth, as had many of the Saxon men of his generation, and he had been very good at it. Unlike Witta, though, Frithavold was not as wealthy, and his army not as big. But he was Witta's cousin, and the two men loved each other. Frithavold and Witta often fought together against their enemies, and Octa knew it was his father who had convinced many of the other warlords to make Witta the chief. The Saxon people did not have a king, not like the other tribes around them. Warlords ruled over their clans, and they would often meet to discuss laws and dispense justice. But when the Saxon people faced a great threat, they would vote for a chief warlord, one who ruled them like a king until the threat had passed. And many of the warlords did not like Witta for that role. Octa had heard the whispers, but he kept them from Othric. Some warlords thought Witta was too greedy, and that he would refuse to give up the mantle once the crisis was quelled. But Octa knew that many of them were only jealous of his father's cousin, because he was more powerful than them all. In fact, combined with Frithavold's army, Witta's army was larger than those of most of the warlords together. "My cousin?" Frithavold stood and faced Witta. Fritherwold was taller than Witter by half a head, but Witter still seemed to tower over him. "Before our friends and the gods, I will ask a favour of you." Witter smiled. "What favour is that?" Octa sensed they had already discussed this favour, but like those around him, he raised an eyebrow. "You know my youngest, Octa. He was raised in your hall, and you fed and clothed him. You taught him to fight with spear and shield. Octa and your son are more like brothers than Octa is to his own." Octa frowned as he wondered what his father was doing. Everyone knew Octa was raised by Witter. He was the youngest son, and Witter wanted him to stay in his hall so that he could guarantee the loyalty of Fritherwold. But Fritherwold had been too eager to give him up. He already had 3 other sons and 5 daughters to feed, so one less mouth in his hall had suited him. The gods, though, had deemed that Octa would be Fritherwold's only remaining son. His brothers had all fallen in battles against other tribes, and his older sisters had been married off, one of them to Utric, so that the 2 cousins had an even closer family bond. The 3 younger sisters were still children, and it would be many winters before they were old enough to be married off. "Octa is a fine man, and skilled with the spear." Witter looked at Octa, whose heart raced at the compliments. The spear was the weapon of Woden, the chief god worshipped by the Saxon people and the Angles to the north, and the other tribes in the region, and so the spear was the principal weapon of the Saxons. Although many of the experienced warriors had swords and axes as well, a sign of their status, as swords were expensive, and the only way most of them got one was to kill another for it. Utric clapped Octa on the back, and his friends all cheered, but then fell silent as Octa's father spoke. "Then I ask that you allow my son to be one of Utric's shield-bearers in the battle tomorrow." Everyone in the hall gasped, and even Octa gaped at his father. The shield-bearer was a role reserved only for the best of the warriors, because their role was to protect the warlord, often by giving their own lives. Octa looked at his mother, who was sitting beside Fritherwold and smiling at him. She had always told him he was fated to be a great warrior, like her father had been. "Octa," Witter called, "do you think you have what it takes to be a shield-bearer? To protect my son from the spears that mean to take his life?" The mead hall fell silent as all eyes fell on Octa. His heart fluttered when he looked at his father and saw the fire in his eyes. Fritherwold meant for Octa to raise his standing with Witter. That way the gods would bless Octa, and his path forward would be easier. But Octa had never thought his father would ask for him to be Utric's shield-bearer. Octa did not really know his father that well. They only saw each other during feasts, or when Fritherwold came to march off to battle with Witter. And since Octa had become a man, he had stayed in Witter's hall. All his friends were here, and he needed to prove himself in battle before he could return to his father's hall. His mother would visit more often, and since his father had 2 more wives, Fritherwold never seemed to care, so Octa had a much stronger bond with her. He looked at his mother again, who nodded. Her eyes, like Fritherwold's, were filled with fire. Octa glanced at Witter's shield-bearers, 2 grizzled old warriors with arms and faces covered in scars, and saw how they glared at him. Instead of feeling embarrassed, Octa was annoyed by them. Why could he not be a shield-bearer? He might never have fought a battle before, but Witter, the greatest of the Saxon warriors, had taught him how to fight with all weapons. He had even bested Utric as many times as Utric had bested him in sparring sessions. Octa was as good a warrior as everyone else in Witter's mead hall, and he was certain that he would make a name for himself when they fought those who wanted to steal their lands. So he squared his shoulders and returned the glares of the older warriors. "I do, Lord Witter." Octa raised his cup, I swear to the gods we hold sacred, to Woden, Tu, and Tunor, that I will stand by Utric's side and protect him, even if I must give my life to do so. My shield will never drop and my spear will never waver. I will kill those who try to harm Utric, and I will feed their corpses to the ravens." Witta watched him for what felt like a long time, as did everyone else in the hall, as the flames continued to dance in the hearth-fire. Then Witta smiled. "Then so be it. Octa will be one of Utric's shield-bearers when they fight the Thuringian bastards." Witta turned to Fritherwold, and the two of them gripped forearms as those in the hall cheered. Apart from Witta's shield-bearers, who scowled at Octa, Octa ignored them as his friends clapped him on the back, and Utric filled his cup. "To my shield-bearer!" Utric roared, and they emptied their cups. Octa felt his head spin, and wasn't sure if it was because of the mead or the occasion as the slaves brought cuts of meats around the tables for the people to eat. At the back of the mead hall, Octa saw an old man sitting by himself, his broad-brimmed hat on the table in front of him. He was astonished to realize that the old man only had one eye, and that it was fixed on Octa. But Octa then forgot about the old man as he stuck a chunk of meat in his mouth and glanced at Heilwig, who barely took her eyes off him. The gods had blessed him, and tomorrow Octa would make a name for himself in the battle against the invaders, just like his father had done. But tonight he would make Heilwig his woman, and there was nothing her father could do about it. Chapter 2. A boot to the ribs woke Octa the following morning. His eyes snapped open, and he was about to curse the bastard who kicked him when he saw his father standing over him. "Father!" The word struggled to come out of his dry mouth, and he looked around for some mead to wet his throat, but couldn't find any. Fritherwold did not respond. Instead, his eyes lingered on the woman still sleeping beside Octa. Octa glanced at Heilwig, who, like him, was wearing nothing under the furs they were under. He looked around him, trying to find his trousers, and saw that most of the warriors were already up and preparing for the battle. Utric winked at him when he saw Octa looking his way, and Octa scowled, wondering why he hadn't woken him. "You better hope her father doesn't find her here. He is a proud man and will cut your head off," Fritherwold said, but there was no anger in his voice. Octa rubbed the sleep from his eyes and smiled as he remembered sleeping with Heilwig after the feast. She had been more eager than he had anticipated, and, judging from the scowls on the faces of some of the warriors, louder too. "Fridemar can try if he wants. The bastard is too old to lift his spear." Fritherwold grunted. "That might be, but he is still good with a sword. Now, come, we must talk." Octa nodded and climbed out from under the furs. Heilwig opened her eyes, and when she saw where she was and who stood over them, her face turned red, and she hid under the furs. "Where's my dress?" she whispered to Octa, who only shrugged. "How in Frigga's name should I know? I don't even know where my pants are." For a moment, Octa wondered if Utric and the others had hidden their clothes, but then his father handed him his trousers and tunic. Octa nodded his thanks and got dressed, as his father said to Heilwig, "Get home, girl, before your father finds you here." Heilwig poked her head out from under the furs and wrapped them around her before she got to her feet and scurried out of the mead hall, her cheeks bright red as the other warriors whistled at her. "Fucking a man's daughter is one thing, son, but did you have to do it in the mead hall? Her reputation and her father's will be ruined because you thought only with your cock." Octa grinned at his father. "It doesn't matter what others think. Now they know she is my woman." "You plan to wed her?" his father asked with a raised eyebrow. Octa shrugged. "Perhaps." Octa knew his father would prefer that he marry someone with a higher standing, but it was normal for their people to have more than one wife. Fritherwold grunted before he said, "Today you march to your first battle." Octa stood straight and faced his father, even as his head spun from drinking too much the night before. "You will be Utric's shield-bearer, and you should look like one." Octa frowned, and then spotted his father's slave behind him with a bundle in his hands. Fritherwold signalled for the man to step forward, and he placed the bundle on a nearby table. "I'll not need this today, so you wear it. It has kept me safe in many battles." Octa's eyes widened as he stared at his father's chainmail vest. "Father, are you sure?" Very few warriors had chainmail vests. They were expensive and hard to maintain. Those who did usually took them from those they killed. It was a sign of their skill as a warrior, and Octa was certain that many warriors would resent him for wearing one when he was still an untested warrior. But he didn't care about that as he ran his fingers over the many links that had been meticulously riveted together. It must have taken the blacksmiths many moons to make this vest. "You are my last remaining son, my heir. I do not want to lose you like I lost your brothers. I am too old to make more sons, and your sisters have only given me granddaughters so far." Octa raised an eyebrow at his father, who had only seen 40 winters, but kept quiet about that. "I will wear it with pride, father." Fritherwold nodded, and his face turned serious. "Good. Remember, Octa, keep your shield up and protect Utric. It took much to convince Witter to let you stand as his son's shield-bearer, so do not let me down." "I won't, father. I'll make you and mother proud." Fritherwold stared at Octa for a few heartbeats, and then nodded. "Gods be with you, my son." Octa barely heard the words as he stared at his father's chainmail vest, just as he didn't notice his father leaving and Utric approaching him. "That's a fine gift," Utric said, and when Octa looked up, he saw that his cousin was also wearing a chainmail vest. But his was made especially for him, and Octa knew that none of the other warriors would be disgruntled about Utric wearing it. "We will look like gods when we face the Thuringians." Octa returned Utric's smile and lifted the chainmail vest from the table. He grunted at its weight, which only made Utric laugh, before he helped Octa put it on. Octa rolled his shoulders and did his best to adjust the chainmail vest, but no matter what he tried, it still sat uncomfortably. It was too large for him, as his father was broader in the shoulder, and Octa prayed it would not hinder him during the battle. "How do they fight in these things?" he asked, and Utric shrugged. "Father said you'd get used to it." A horn blew from outside the hall before Octa could respond, and they both stared at the open door. "We leave soon," Utric said, with a broad grin on his face. Octa's hand went to his stomach as it clenched, and he told himself that it was because he had drunk too much. "I need a piss," he said when Utric frowned at him. Utric laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "Then go piss before you wet your trousers and meet me outside." Utric left Octa, who rolled his shoulders again as he tried to get used to the weight of his father's chainmail vest. Octa went to the armory, which was beside the mead hall, and was about to grab a spear when a hand gripped his arm. Siegfried, one of Witter's shield-bearers, curled his lip at Octa. "I have fought more battles than there are hairs in your beard. It should be me standing by Utric's side, not a boy like you." Octa smiled at Siegfried, even though his heart was racing in his chest. Siegfried was one of Witter's most experienced men, and had even helped teach Octa how to fight. "Perhaps Witter feels you are too old." Siegfried glared at him, and then that glare turned into a smile. "Perhaps. Or perhaps your father overestimates your skill. He has never seen you fight, has he?" The older warrior leaned closer. "You better pray to Tew you do well, boy. because if anything happens to Otric, then it is not just Witter's wrath you'd have to deal with." "It is our enemy that needs to pray, not me," Octa said. But he still did what Siegfried said, and prayed to Tuve and Woden, asking both gods to guide him. The horn blew outside again, and the warrior smiled at him as he handed him a spear. "You better go, Octa, son of Ritherwold. They are waiting for you." Octa grabbed a shield and rushed out of the armory. Outside there was an excited murmur as the people of Witter's village mingled with the warriors who were about to march off to battle. Young boys gaped at the warriors in their armor, and Octa remembered how he had once stared at the warriors the same way. It seemed that even the gods were excited, as the sun shone brightly in the sky and not a cloud could be seen. Octa caught sight of Heilwig, now dressed, and was about to wink at her when he saw her father standing beside her, his face dark as he glared at Octa. But Octa knew the old warrior wouldn't do a thing to him, even if he wanted to. Witter treated Octa like he was his own son, which meant very few of the people in the village would do anything against him. Otric stood beside his father, and Frithavold and his mother stood beside them. They both smiled when they saw Octa wearing his chainmail vest, but Octa saw how Witter raised an eyebrow. He also heard how many of the other warriors grumbled, as only experienced warriors should wear chainmail vests, not untested ones. But he ignored them as he took his place beside Otric. On the other side of the warlord's son stood Landric, the second shield-bearer. He glanced at Octa and shook his head, but Octa paid him no attention. Despite the uneasiness he felt in the pit of his stomach, he knew this was the day he would make a name for himself. This was the day he would show them all who he really was. Witter took a few steps forward. "Today is a proud day for me. It is the day my son will lead my men to battle those bastard Thuringians who think they can steal our lands. Today my son will become a man." The people of Witter's clan cheered as Otric puffed out his chest and mounted his horse. "Men of Witter, let's go to war!" He punched his spear into the air, and the people cheered even more. They all knew this wasn't going to be a large battle. The Thuringian raiding party had no more than 50 men, if that, and Witter had made sure to send just as many warriors with his son, most of them young warriors like Octa about to fight their first battle, but there were also experienced warriors amongst them. The real reason for this was for Otric to get a taste for leading men into battle, and for Octa to learn to fight by his side, just as his father fought beside Witter. Octa was about to mount his horse when Witter grabbed his arm, and dark eyes bored into him. "Your father is one of the best warriors I know," he said, and Octa nodded, not sure what to say to that. "I pray to the gods that his blood runs in your veins, because if you don't bring my son back alive, then your blood will run in my hole." Octa paled as Witter smiled and walked away. His father gripped his shoulder. "Pay no mind to him. Just remember, Octa, keep your shield up and your eyes open." Frithavold took his sword belt from his waist and tied it around Octa's. "Father?" Octa's eyes widened. "Are you certain?" He looked at his mother, who smiled at him, her eyes filled with pride as she nodded at him. "Aye, you are my son, and I will have you able to protect yourself." Octa looked at his father, unsure of what to say. He did not know his father as well as he wanted to, and had always thought of him as a hard man. "You are destined for great things, my son," his mother said, as she put a hand on his cheek. "And that journey starts today." Octa smiled at his mother as he mounted his horse and followed Otric as he led his father's army out of the village gates. Out of the corner of his eye he saw the same old man he had seen in the mead hall the night before, and he frowned at the way the one-eyed man smiled at him as a raven crowed from the trees. Octa swallowed hard as a sweat bead ran down the side of his face, desperate to keep the bile from reaching the back of his throat. He wanted to believe it was because he had drunk too much at the feast they had the night before, as he stared at the approaching army, led by a large man whose horse looked small under him. Cheers and war songs drifted over the breeze, only making the trepidation he felt worse, while others cried out to the gods. "This is it, cousin. Today we kill these bastards and make our fathers proud." Otric slapped Octa on the shoulder, which nearly made him vomit. Octa tried to smile, but was sure it came as more of a grimace. The unease he had felt before had only grown as they rode to the place of battle, not far from Witter's village. Octa tried to find the courage he had felt the night before when he had made the oath to Witter, but couldn't, no matter how hard he tried. Otric did not have his father's full army behind him. He did not even have his best warriors. But that was because this wasn't a battle worthy of the gods. Their enemy was a large raiding party of Thuringians, and Otric was sent by his father to kill them and to send a message back to their king. And that message was that this land belonged to the Saxons. Witter and Frithavold, along with the other warlords, had stayed behind in Witter's meat hole to plan for the real battle, which was sure to come after this skirmish. But even though this was only a skirmish, Octa could not stop the fingers of fear gripping his spine. Like Otric, Octa had never fought a battle before. The only blood he had ever seen at the end of his spear belonged to the animals he had hunted. Unlike Otric, who behaved like the son of a warlord should, and the 50 warriors behind them, their songs and war cries making his head hurt, Octa was terrified. Otric stood tall, his dark hair blowing in the wind as he puffed out his chest and grinned at his enemies. Octa guessed his cousin did not feel the same fear as he did. Like Octa, Otric wore a chainmail vest, but his had gold rings along the edges, and he had a fine sword in his hand. He glanced at the shield in his hand and remembered the oath he had made to Witter at the feast, in front of the gods of the Saxons, Dew, Woden, and Tunor. He had sworn he would stand by Otric's side as his shield-bearer, and that he would die if he needed to protect his cousin. Octa had stood tall when he had made the oath, his father beaming at him, and Octa was sure the gods were watching him. On Otric's other side stood Landric, a man who had fought more battles than Octa had seen winters. He glanced at Octa and said, "If you need to empty your bowels, then do it now, Octa. Once the battle starts, the only thing that should be in your head is keeping Otric alive." Behind them, their horses were led away, so they wouldn't be spooked by the battle. The Thuringians had spotted them, and instead of turning and running like Octa was hoping they would, they dismounted their horses and formed a battle line. Their leader stood in front of them, undoubtedly scowling as he stared at the Saxons in front of him. Otric laughed. "Don't worry about Octa. He will not let me down." Octa took a deep breath as he gripped his spear and shield to hide his fear and whispered a prayer to Tunor, asking the hammer-wielding god to protect him and to give him the strength he needed. The courage he had felt the night before when Witter's mead flowed through his veins and his stomach filled with boar was gone, and in its place was only a fear he had never known before. He did not see Otric give the signal, and his heart jumped when the horn, to announce the attack, blew near him. "For Dew! For Woden! For my father!" Otric shouted, his voice barely carrying over the noise of the 50 warriors behind him, and charged at the enemy. Octa thought he was about to piss himself, or perhaps he had, because his trousers felt wet as he ran to keep up with Otric. The shield in his hands felt heavier than it had a few moments ago, and Octa worried he might faint as he struggled to breathe under the weight of his father's chainmail vest. As the enemy came closer, Octa just had enough time to notice the scar on the cheek of the leader of the Thuringian raiding party. A thunderous crash, like a mountain being ripped apart, tore through Octa, and before he could stop himself, he vomited. Luckily, Otric was too focused on the enemy in front of them, his eyes wild with anticipation, to notice, and Octa's cheeks burnt with shame, even as he tried to keep the shield and spear up. Landric glanced at Octa and shook his head before he lifted his shield and blocked the blow aimed at Otric. He stabbed forward with his spear, skewering the Thuringian who had tried to kill Otric, and all Octa could do was watch. Otric, oblivious to the attack, stabbed forward with his sword, laughing as it struck the shield of his opponent, while Octa cowered behind the shield he was supposed to protect Otric with. "Octa, lift your shield!" Landric roared at him, and Octa nodded as he fought the urge to run. He caught the glimpse of an axe and instinctively raised his shield, more to protect himself than Otric, and felt his heart thud as the axe struck his shield. Something warm and sticky splashed across his face, making him scream out in shock, and when Octa glanced to his left, he saw Otgar, one of his friends, gaping at him. His throat cut. Octa tasted the blood in his mouth and vomited again, as the man he had shared mead the previous night with died. Otric was not aware of anything around him as he struck at his opponent again. This time his sword came back with blood on it, and as he turned to Octa to gloat, roaring with delight, the Thuringian leader stepped into the place of the warrior Otric had just killed, and swung his large two-handed axe at Otric's head. Octa screamed as he forced himself to lift the shield and cried out as the shock of the blow rattled his arms and numbed his fingers. With wide eyes, he watched as the shield fell from his hands, while the large warrior pulled his arm back to attack again. Octa knew this was his moment to make a name for himself, the moment his mother had told him about. All he had to do was thrust his spear forward and stab the leader of the Thuringians in the stomach before he could kill Otric. Then he would be the hero, and others would sing songs about him. But instead, Octa froze as a spear streaked past the large warrior and caught Otric in the shoulder. Otric staggered backwards from the blow, but Octa's relief at seeing that the links of his chainmail vest held was short-lived when another spear sliced Otric's cheek open. Otric's eyes were wide when he saw that Octa no longer had his shield in his hands, but before he could say anything, they both heard the large warrior roaring and turned to see the axe coming for Otric's head. Everything seemed to slow down for Octa as he looked past Otric, praying to the gods that Landric had seen the threat, and felt numb when he saw the man on his knees with a spear in his side and his eyes vacant. At that moment, Otric must have known what was about to happen, because he shook his head at Octa and muttered something that Octa could not hear over the blood pumping in his ears. Octa glanced at the large axe coming for Otric, his cousin and closest friend, the man he had grown up with and shared mead with, the man whose life he was supposed to be protecting. Octa, no longer able to control his fear, dropped his spear and fled before the large warrior's axe split Otric's skull open. Chapter 3. Octa ran. He ran until he could no longer hear the sounds of the battle behind him, and then he ran further. As he ran, all he could see was Otric's face, just before the axe came down, his eyes pleading with Octa to help him, to save him. Tears streamed down Octa's cheeks as his lungs burnt, but still he kept running. He kept running until his legs gave way and he fell to the ground. The hilt of his father's sword dug into his stomach, and as he tried to get back to his feet, the chainmail vest his father had given him weighed him down. Octa wrapped his arms around himself and cried because of the death of his cousin, a death caused by his cowardice. He was supposed to make a name for himself, to make his parents proud, just like he was supposed to protect his cousin. But instead he had run from a battle. Octa curled into a ball as he sobbed and cursed himself. A while later, Octa opened his eyes, and for a moment thought he was still in Witta's mead hall. But as his eyes focused on what was in front of him, he frowned at the grass and the blue sky above his head. He was about to rub his face when he saw his hand was red with blood and remembered what had happened. "Otric, forgive me," he said as fresh tears wet his cheeks, but he knew there was no point. Otric was dead because of him. Octa sat there for a while longer, and when he could cry no more, he forced himself to his feet. His shoulder ached, and he did not know if it was because of the battle or from the fall. He stared at the dried blood on his hands, and before he could stop himself, he dropped to his knees and retched. There was no food left in his stomach to vomit out. That had all come out during the battle. Wiping the bile from his mouth with the back of his hand, Octa stared at the darkening sky and watched as the clouds drifted past and birds flew overhead. He wanted to blame the gods. He wanted to curse Dew and Woden and Tonor. But he knew it was not their fault. He was the one who had failed his cousin, and not just his cousin, but his father and clan as well. His hand went to the hilt of his father's sword as he remembered how proud Frithawald had looked that morning when he had given him the sword. Octa had wanted so much to be the brave warrior his father and Witter were. But in the heat of the battle, his courage had deserted him, and he had left his friends behind to die. Images of the battle flashed through his mind again. Snarled faces and men calling to the gods, spears and swords flashing in the sunlight, and blood spraying through the air. And the large Thuringian warrior, his axe held above his head, as he prepared to kill Otric. "Forgive me, Otric," Octa said again, as he closed his eyes, hoping that it would stop what had happened next from coming to him. But it didn't. And Octa curled on the ground again, and a fresh wave of tears came. He stayed like that as the sun set and the moon rose, and as the stars shimmered in the night sky. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. Octa woke the next morning, his head pounding and his mouth dry. His stomach rumbled, and he remembered he had not eaten or drunk anything since the day before. Octa looked around him as he tried to work out where he was, but all he saw were hills and forests in the distance. He guessed he must still have been in the lands of the Saxon people as he struggled to his feet, feeling weak from the lack of food. Octa had never gone half a day without eating, and he felt like he might faint. He glanced at the sun, trying to work out which direction he needed to head, but then a thought struck him and almost dropped him to his knees. Where do I go? He looked west in the direction of Witter's Hall and knew he couldn't go back there. Fleeing a battle was one of the worst crimes a Saxon could commit. They were a proud, warlike people. That was why they had so many war gods, and Octa had fled. He dropped to the ground again, his legs unable to hold him as he remembered the oath he had sworn in Witter's Hall when the warlord's mead ran through his veins. And then he shivered when Witter's words the next morning came to him. "If you don't bring my son back alive, then your blood will run in my hall." Octa thought of his father and his mother, and knew he couldn't go to them either. He had brought shame to both of them, and was certain they would not help him. His mother was from a line of famous Saxon warriors, and would not tolerate cowardice. His father was Witter's closest ally, and would never go against him. Even if he wanted to, he couldn't help Octa. Although Octa doubted his father would want to. To shelter a coward made you guilty of the same crime, and his father had too much to lose to do that. Octa was on his own. The life of luxury he had known was gone. No more days drinking the finest mead with his friends, or sleeping with any woman he wanted. No more Heilwig either. She would never go to him, not after what he had done. And no more Otric, his friend and cousin, killed because of him. Octa stayed where he was, as the sun moved through the sky and birds flew over his head. After a while, he frowned as he realized he didn't know who had won the battle. Had the Saxons fled, like he had, after the death of Otric, or had the Thuringians been beaten and sent back to their lands? Did it really matter? His temples throbbed with all the questions, and Octa decided he needed to know what had happened. He needed to do something. Octa picked himself off the ground and walked towards where the battle had been fought. His stomach growled again, and Octa tried to calm it by putting his hand on it. He almost flinched at the feel of the cold metal links of his father's chainmail vest, and felt ashamed that he was still wearing it. But Octa could not get himself to take it off. He did not have the strength to lift the heavy vest over his head, so he kept it on and forced himself to walk to where he had shamed his father and forefathers. He walked for half a day before he reached the battlefield. Along the way he came across a stream and drank thirstily from it before he washed his face and hands clean of the blood that covered him from the battle. But the blood was still under his nails, a constant reminder of his shame. As the sun was past its midpoint, Octa stood at the edge of the battleground, his legs trembling and his heart racing as he stared at the dead bodies that littered the ground. He wanted to turn and run away as the image of Otric dying came to him, but Octa knew he couldn't. He needed to find out what had happened. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to walk amongst the dead, and wished he was one of them, instead of what he was at the moment, a nobody and a coward. Most of the dead were Saxons, which told Octa the Thuringians had won this battle and had driven Witter's men off so they couldn't collect the dead. He wondered if it was his fault, and decided it must have been. His mind replayed the battle as his feet took him to the spot where he had shamed himself. His vision blurred from the tears as he stared at the body of Landric, still with the spear in his side. And then there was Otgar, one of Octa's close friends, his eyes still open in shock. Octa's stomach clenched as his eyes fell on Otgar's open throat, and he remembered how his friend's blood had sprayed over him. "Forgive me, my friend," Octa said, but could not get himself to kneel and close Otgar's eyes. He looked around and frowned when he failed to see Otric's body. A shiver ran down his spine as he considered what that meant. Either the Thuringians had taken his body with them to parade around like a trophy, or the surviving Saxons had taken his body back to his father. Octa prayed it was the latter. His cousin deserved a proper funeral, but he was certain the Thuringians had taken Otric's body with them. Even if they didn't know who he was, the way he was dressed had made it obvious that Otric was someone important. Octa stood where he was, surrounded by the dead of his people, and wondered what he was going to do. Again he thought about going to his father, but then dismissed the idea. He had already disgraced Ritherwold by running from the battle. Not even his mother could help him. All Octa could do was pray that they believed he was dead as well. But Octa was on his own. The gods had abandoned him, and he was no longer a Saxon, because Saxons did not run from the battle. Not knowing what else to do, and not wanting to stand there any longer, Octa turned and walked away from the battleground, and away from his people. He followed the sun, not really sure of where else to go. His head hung low, and his stomach rumbled. Octa still wore the chainmail vest of his father, and he still had his sword around his waist. He wondered if he could use them to go somewhere else and make a name for himself, perhaps even regain his honor, but he dismissed the idea before it even finished in his mind. He had run from a minor battle against Thuringian raiders. How was he going to fight battles and make a name for himself? Octa wondered why the gods had made him a coward. He was a skilled warrior. He knew how to fight, with spear, axe, and sword. But he did not have the courage he needed to stand and face his enemy, to protect his cousin and bring honor to his family. Octa did not know how long he had been walking for, when he came across a bush of berries. His stomach roared like a wild beast as soon as his eyes landed on the dark blue berries that grew on a small tree near the path he was walking on, and he ran towards the bush, grabbing its branches as he ate the berries off them. He did not stop to wonder if these berries were poisonous. Part of him even prayed they were, as he gorged himself until his stomach was full, and he sat there panting. But there were no agonizing stomach cramps or blood-filled vomiting. Octa licked his blue fingers clean and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand before he lay down next to the bush and stared at the darkening sky. As the stars came out, he wondered where he should go. He knew he had to leave the lands of the Saxons. Witta would want his head and was sure to send men after him, and if they found him, he would be tortured before Witta hanged him. They wouldn't even sacrifice him to Woden or Dew, because neither god would want a coward sacrificed in their names. Only the brave had that honor. His stomach filled with the berries, Octa's eyes closed, and he drifted into a deep sleep, interrupted only by the nightmares of Utric being killed and him running away. "My son is dead." Witta stared at the injured warrior in front of him, his mind unable to make sense of the man's words. Word had reached him that they had lost the fight against the Thuringians. But Witta forgot about all that as he glanced over the warrior's shoulders as more injured warriors came into his hall. Some had minor injuries, but a few had to be helped by others. One warrior clutched his stomach, and, from the dark blood that seeped through his fingers, Witta knew that the man would be dead in a few days. All that he understood, but the man's words still made no sense to him as he scanned the injured warriors for Utric, his oldest son. "My son is dead." He repeated the question as he felt his limbs go numb. He jumped to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest as he stormed towards the injured warriors, determined to find his son amongst them. Utric could not be dead. The gods would not do that to him. Witta had been faithful to the gods, he had made his sacrifices and had honored them. But as he searched amongst the injured for Utric, there was no sign of him. None of the injured men were his son. Warlord, Witta's youngest son, and Utric's younger brother, followed him, his hand gripping Witta's tunic as he wailed. The sound only irritated Witta even more as he turned to the warrior that had brought him the news, his face red and fists clenched. "Where is my son?" Warloric's mother grabbed him and took him away from Witta before he lashed out. The warrior looked uncertain of what to say or do as he lowered his head. "Forgive me, my lord. Utric, where is Landric?" Witta grabbed the warrior by his chainmail vest. Landric would not lie to him. Landric would have made sure that Utric had survived. Witta was certain of that. But there was no sign of the man he had sent to keep his son safe. "Where is he?" The warrior paled. "Dead, my lord. Killed in the battle." "Dead? How? What happened? We should have won." The warrior stammered for a heartbeat. "They overwhelmed us, my lord, and when Utric died, the younger warriors panicked and the Thuringians took advantage of that. They slaughtered most of us." Witta gaped at the warrior as his words sunk in. If Landric was dead, then Utric... Witta couldn't even finish the thought as he dropped to his knees, not caring about what the warrior had just told him, of how the Thuringians had killed most of the men he had sent to fight them. "My son!" His face was red as the tears ran down his cheeks. Witta struggled to breathe as his tears choked him up. He did not think about the fact that they had lost the battle, or what that meant for him. "My son!" His body shuddered as he cried. "Witta?" Fritherwold walked towards him and put a hand on his shoulder, but Witta did not respond. He couldn't because he still didn't understand. How could Utric be dead? His son was a skilled warrior. Witta's best men had trained him. "Where is his body?" Fritherwold asked, and the warrior looked away. The Thuringians took it with them, my lord. There were too many of them, and we couldn't stop them. We had to leave the rest of our dead out there as well. And what of my son? Fritterwold asked the warrior, who glanced away from Wita's cousin. Wita looked up and scanned the warriors, but saw no sign of Octa either. Octa, whom he had raised as if he was his own son. The warrior hesitated. "Where is my son?" Fritterwold asked again. The warrior took a deep breath, but before he could say anything, Woldar, one of Wita's most experienced men and one of the few survivors, stood in front of Fritterwold. His nostrils flared even as they were caked with dried blood. "Your son ran." "What?" Fritterwold said, and Wita could hear the shock in his voice. Even in his grief, Wita looked up at Woldar, a warrior he had trusted to keep Otric safe. Just like Fritterwold, he could not believe that Octa would run from a battle. Like Otric, he was skilled, and he was brave. Wita's men had taught him to fight. He would never dishonor Wita like that. Woldar glared at Fritterwold. Octa dropped his spear and shield in the middle of the battle, and he turned and fled with his tail between his legs. Woldar looked at Wita, his face softening. "Forgive me, Wita. Your son died because of Octa." Fritterwold punched Woldar in the face before he could even finish Octa's name. Woldar staggered backwards, and Fritterwold kicked him to the floor. "Do not lie! The gods know my son would never run from a battle." Woldar tried to get to his feet, only for Fritterwold to punch him to the floor again. So he lay where he was and wiped the blood from his mouth as he glared at Fritterwold. "As true as my witness, I do not lie. Octa froze just as a large Thuringian faced him and Otric, and when the Thuringian lifted his axe, Octa turned and ran. Your son is a coward." Fritterwold roared and launched himself at Woldar, who could not raise his arms fast enough to protect himself as Fritterwold kicked him in the head. Wita watched, stunned, as his mind struggled to make sense of what he had just been told. He looked at Fritterwold, his cousin, who was stamping on Woldar's head before the other warriors could drag him away, his mouth frothing as he screamed at the fallen warrior. "You lie, you bastard!" Wita struggled to his feet and rubbed his head as he tried to clear the fog in his mind. "Octa ran?" Woldar, his face bloodied and bruised, nodded at him. "I wish it wasn't so, Wita. I liked the boy as much as I liked your son. But he proved to be nothing but a coward, and he caused your son's death." Wita's anger slowly took over his grief as he looked at his cousin, the man who had asked for his son to be Utric's shield-bearer. At first, Wita had thought it was a good idea. He had believed Octa was strong. For a moment he heard a whisper in his mind. Was this part of Fritterwold's plan? Did he want Utric to die? As the thoughts came to him, he noticed an old man with a broad-brimmed hat sitting in the corner of his meat hole. But Wita then forgot about him as he glared at his cousin. "My son did not run. He is no coward," Fritterwold said, but even Wita could hear the doubt in his voice. Wita glanced at the other surrounding warriors. They all turned away from him, so he pointed at one of them, a young man he knew to be a friend of Utric and Octa. "Does Woldar speak the truth?" The young man nodded, even as he avoided looking at Wita and Fritterwold. Wita glared at Fritterwold, who shook his head as his face paled. "Octa would not. Octa did," Wita said, his voice strained because of his grief and anger. "Your son ran, and my son died because of it. Wita, get out of my hole and out of my village. Get out of my sight." Wita clenched his fists as he struggled to control himself. "I will grieve for my son and collect our dead warriors. and then I will decide what to do with you." Fritherwold opened his mouth to speak, but then seemed to think better of it as he turned and walked out of the mead hall, his warriors behind him. Wheater turned to the others in the hall. "From this moment onwards, Octa's life is forfeited. He is a coward, and will be known as Octa the Coward. If he is seen, it is your duty to the gods to cut him down and to bring me his head. As the gods are my witnesses, Octa the Coward will pay for the death of my son." Octa woke the next morning.